From this moment on, you and I are going to be traveling back in time, nearly 100 years into the past. It is now the evening of the 4th of July, 1928. You and I are standing out of view just around the corner of a building at Croydon Airport, just south of London. Idling on a runway ahead of us is a small private plane which sits waiting for its passengers to arrive. In due time, you begin to hear the sound of vehicles approaching. 2 black limousines come into view before parking nearby the small plane. A group of men and women emerge and begin climbing aboard, welcomed by the pilot, Donald Drew. It might be hard to pick him out of the crowd, but one of the men is Alfred Loewenstein, a banker and entrepreneur who presently, in 1928, is the 3rd richest man on the planet. He doesn't know it yet, but he just took his final steps atop the Earth. According to the others aboard the flight, things seemed to be going fine for a short while after takeoff. Alfred had apparently been in high spirits, reading a book. As the flight began to cross over the English Channel, Alfred set his book down, sat up from his seat, and walked towards the back of the cabin. He stopped to chat with one of the men aboard before entering through the door at the rear of the plane, through which the bathroom sat. This was the last time he was ever seen alive. To accurately portray exactly what happened aboard this flight, it's important that we establish the layout of Alfred's plane, which was relatively small by today's standards. At the front of the plane lay the pilot's cockpit. Behind that, a small cabin able to seat several people, which on this particular day held Loewenstein and 6 of his associates. At the rear, in a separate room behind a thin wall, sat the door to the bathroom on the left and the plane's only exit door to the right. Alfred apparently had been in the bathroom for quite a long time, to the point where Fred Baxter, Loewenstein's valet, decided to check on him. He entered through the partition leading to the rear section of the plane before knocking on the bathroom door. Unnerved at the silence that followed, he opened the door, finding the room to be completely empty. While in this rear compartment, Baxter realized that the exit door was slightly ajar, flapping in the wind. There's obviously a lot to unpack here. The truth behind what happened in the sky that day is unclear, complicated, and shrouded in numerous different conspiracies. Together, we'll investigate what really happened on that afternoon in 1928. This is the mid-flight disappearance of Alfred Loewenstein. So, unless you came here already aware of this case, I'm going to assume that you probably have never even heard of the name Alfred Loewenstein. Back in the 1920s, he was mostly known for his investments in the early stages of several industries, such as artificial silk and electric power. These investments would quickly lead to his accumulation of massive wealth, which would equate to around $1 billion today. Needless to say, this one man held an extreme amount of power and influence, especially for the time period, making this incident all the more intriguing. He was married to a woman named Madeleine Misson, a woman who came from a prominent and wealthy Belgian family. It seemed that the husband and wife were simply married out of practicality rather than actual love for one another. Alfred and Madeleine apparently lived 2 completely separate lives, sleeping in different rooms when together and often being in 2 separate countries, with Alfred constantly traveling for business. That afternoon, Loewenstein was flying to Brussels, located in his home country of Belgium, aboard his private plane, a Fokker F-7. The disappearance occurred while the plane was flying above the English Channel before they were set to cross over into France. As soon as Fred Baxter realized that something terrible had happened, he alerted the other passengers and ran to the cockpit in an attempt to make pilot Donald Drew aware of the situation. However, the Fokker F-7, despite some soundproofing work that Alfred had done, was very loud, especially towards the engine at the front, making it difficult for the pilot to hear what Fred was trying to tell him. He ended up pulling out a piece of paper to write down his explanation of what was going on before handing it to Drew. Upon realizing the severity of the situation, pilot Donald Drew then decided to make an emergency landing on a beach at Fort Mardek near Dunkirk. This was a bit of a strange decision though, since directly ahead of him sat a French airport that he easily could have landed at. However, unbeknownst to them, the beach was actually under control of the French military, who immediately had the 6 remaining passengers arrested and brought into questioning. When the passengers were all asked what had happened, they simply replied that they had lost their employer over the English Channel. However, they refused to tell them Loewenstein's name for over 30 minutes. Instead, they just sat there with some of them crying and others shaking or chattering their teeth. Now, giving everyone the benefit of the doubt, I can definitely see how having your employer fall out of an airplane would make you a bit anxious. But you're telling me that they couldn't give up his name for over 30 minutes? I'm trying to think of why they might have hesitated for so long, but I'm struggling to come up with a good answer. If what happened really was just a simple accident, why weren't the passengers just being honest and revealing what happened and who it was so they could go save him or recover him? To me, this hesitation seems like it stems from guilt or fear of some kind. Since they didn't expect to find themselves in custody, maybe they were trying to remain silent in order to save face. We'll go down that road in a moment, but for now, let's get down all the hard facts of the case. Eventually, the passengers of the flight were released as there had been no evidence of foul play, and the whole thing seemed to have been some terrible accident, or potentially even a suicide. However, because the incident occurred farther out than the French 3-mile territorial limit at sea, they considered it out of their jurisdiction and refused to investigate what happened. The authorities in Britain and Belgium took the same stance, and ultimately, no formal investigation was held by any nation. In fact, there were essentially no attempts at finding the body at all, from anyone. That is, except to a certain extent from Loewenstein's wife. As it turns out, Belgian law actually prohibited her from obtaining a death certificate without presenting a body to the government. And as a result, wouldn't be able to read his will or claim his estate for several years. Of course, her desire to locate the whereabouts of her likely deceased husband didn't seem suspicious or out of the ordinary at the time, but given what would occur over the coming weeks, it would. Again, more on that later. For around 2 whole weeks, nobody knew exactly where he had gone, and the news media was quick to write plenty of speculative articles regarding his suspicious disappearance. The New York Times discussed Loewenstein's supposed growing absent-mindedness, which had been noticed by those who knew him personally. They discussed how it may have caused him to open the exit door rather than the one to the bathroom. Others theorized that Loewenstein's business ventures may have been on the verge of collapse, or that he had run into trouble with certain partners and that he had either committed suicide or staged it. Another rumor, popularized by the Exchange Telegraph, outlined the story of a French fisherman who supposedly witnessed a parachute descending from the sky over the English Channel on the night of his disappearance. He then claimed that as the person fell towards the water, a boat rushed out to intercept them and spirit them away. Other papers discussed similar possibilities. One wrote that Loewenstein had never even boarded the plane at all. Another that he was seen exiting the plane after landing on the beach. Even that he was having an affair with his wife, and that the whole thing was an intricate plan to start a new life. There were claims that he had withdrawn a large sum of money before the flight as well, which also added to the theory that he had staged his entire disappearance. These articles, with their claims ranging widely in veracity, made obtaining the actual facts of the case fairly difficult at the time, coating the entire incident in misinformation. It is now the 19th of July, 15 days since Loewenstein's final flight. Many of the claims mentioned earlier are about to be laid to rest. We are now sitting in a small boat out on the English Channel, about 10 miles off the coast of France. If you take a look east from here, you should just barely be able to see a small boat near the horizon. I would have brought you a bit closer, but we don't want to interfere. Aboard that boat are 2 French fishermen, and in about 5 minutes, they're going to come across a decomposing corpse floating in the water. The corpse, by this point, is horribly bloated and still has on clothes as well as a wristwatch. Imprinted on the strap, they will find a name: Alfred Loewenstein. The body had apparently smelled so terrible that they weren't even able to keep it aboard their ship. Instead, the man wrapped it up in an extra sail, tied it to the boat, dumped it out into the water, and proceeded to tow it along the surface back to shore. After the discovery of the body, the family requested for an autopsy to be performed in order to rule out the possibility of any foul play on either their own behalf or of those aboard the plane. Because of Loewenstein's social prominence and the intense media speculation, his family wanted his cause of death to be publicly known before he was officially laid to rest. The autopsy went on for a prolonged period of time. Apparently, it took them 2 months to get the final report out on the 10th of September. The report concluded that Loewenstein had plenty of broken bones, including a fractured skull, all of which were determined to have been the result of his impact with the water. They also found that he had in fact been alive when he hit the water and died shortly after impact. A small amount of alcohol was actually found in his system, which is weird because Alfred didn't drink. Now, as we've already discussed, there were plenty of different theories thrown around at the time, but once all the facts of the case are taken into consideration, we are left with a handful of plausible scenarios. Let's discuss the official story first, which follows the narrative given by Loewenstein's associates aboard the plane with him during the incident. According to them, again, he simply set his book down, sat up, and walked to the back of the plane to use the bathroom, and at some point shortly after that, fell out of the exit door. To be honest, there are so many holes in their story that it's almost hilarious. For one, the exit door, which was clearly marked exit, had a window and was completely different looking than the bathroom door. But okay, for the sake of argument, let's just say he was a bit clumsy and wasn't paying attention. Fine. The thing is, the door opened outwards and was positioned in such a way that the wind from the engine would slam it shut should it be opened mid-flight. According to many others who were familiar with the aircraft at the time, it would have been impossible to open the door mid-flight. The following is a quote from Royal Air Force pilot George Terrell, taken from a Toronto newspaper. Even if a man could get the door open, a super strong man, as soon as the pressure was released, the door would slam shut. Furthermore, as soon as the outside door was opened the slightest bit, everyone inside would be aware of it. A blast of wind would blow through the cabin. I find it impossible that Loewenstein could have escaped from the plane without anyone noticing. Even when recalling the situation after the fact, not one of them mentioned feeling any sort of wind pressure or hearing any kind of noise from the door. Furthermore, the manufacturer of the plane actually ended up conducting their own investigation into the matter. During a flight, they had 2 engineers attempt to open the door from the inside. They found that it was impossible for either of them to do it alone, and even with all their effort, it took both of them to even allow barely enough room for a single person to escape, with only an instant of time, before the door would immediately and loudly slam shut. We also need to discuss one crucial design element of the rear portion of the plane. As shown in this diagram of Loewenstein's Fokker F-7, the door that sections off the rear entranceway from the main cabin simultaneously acted as the door to the bathroom in order to save space. This means that if the bathroom door is closed, the partition between the two rooms is open. I've only seen a handful of different sources even mention this fact, despite it revealing a huge discrepancy in the official story. Going back to the actual incident, remember how Fred Baxter got up to check on Loewenstein, knocked on the door, and opened it to find the bathroom empty? If this is true, and Fred really did find the bathroom door to be closed, that means that the partition door was open, because it's the same door. Here's a photo from another Fokker F-7 to give an idea of how seriously tiny this airplane was. Assuming the door had been opened even for a brief moment, the air would have rushed right into the cabin since it's only a few feet away from the door, and everyone surely would have been alerted. The second theory involves a more grim scenario. That Alfred Loewenstein jumped out of the plane of his own volition and killed himself. Loewenstein's wife, Madeline, has publicly claimed that this is the scenario she personally believes, stating that her and Alfred's marriage had been falling apart, and as we discussed earlier, that they often went about their days independent of one another. However, this scenario has plenty of problems as well. First, just before boarding the plane, Loewenstein actually entered the airport to make a phone call to a Canadian financial magnate named Sir Robert Holt to finalize plans for dinner later that week. It seemed that Loewenstein had been actively planning for the future. Further evidence of this are several notes found by mechanic Robert Little just after landing in France following his disappearance. Apparently, while aboard the flight, he had actually been writing reminders to himself regarding future business deals, ideas, and other upcoming plans. Not something most would feel compelled to do, knowing that their lives would be shortly coming to an end. However, for whatever reason, these notes vanished, and their exact contents are unknown. There are plenty of facts that don't quite line up with this theory either. Apparently, he was in high spirits that evening as the plane was taking off, so unless he was masking his emotions for some unknown reason, or had a sudden change of heart, this doesn't check out. For these reasons, as well as the other factors we talked about before, such as the fact that he probably couldn't even open the door if he wanted to, lead me to believe that this scenario is even less likely than the first. Which brings us to the final theory, the one that I personally believe makes the most sense, that Loewenstein was murdered. This would imply that every single person aboard the plane that evening, all of which were employees of Loewenstein, were either paid off by some unknown party or were threatened into submission after the fact. There are plenty of different ways a plan like this could have been executed, with several people potentially to blame. Some have theorized that Loewenstein held connections to shady business partners, or even to criminal circles who might have wanted him wiped out. However, in my eyes, from the information I've gathered and from actually following where his massive wealth went, the most likely culprit is none other than Loewenstein's wife, Madeline, the sole heir to his fortune. Think about it. Madeline was the only person to search for the body because the plan was to receive his money, all of which would have been held for years unless he was recovered. On top of that, their marriage really did seem to be quite cold. They never slept in the same room, Alfred was never around, constantly doing business, maybe in his wife's eyes, neglecting her. It's entirely possible that Madeline had come into contact with each of the passengers who would be aboard the flight that day, all of which were employees of Loewenstein, and conspired to murder him in exchange for large sums of money. This obviously would be no problem for Madeline once she received her late husband's estate. This could also explain why the pilot decided to make the landing on the beach rather than taking the plane down to a traditional airport. Perhaps they were simply trying to avoid interactions with any others during the immediate aftermath to avoid suspicion. Another fact of the case that I can't seem to wrap my head around is the fact that Madeline didn't even show up to her own husband's funeral. This is one of the most suspicious parts of this whole story. I mean, even if the relationship was a bit strained, not showing up to the funeral, even after he supposedly died in a tragic accident, just sounds unheard of. There are plenty of rumors adding to the theory, one of them stating that Donald Drew actually went on to live a very affluent life, one that didn't really make sense for his occupation as a pilot. There was even discussion that Donald and Madeline had even had an affair, but again, due to the intense media speculation at the time, it's very difficult or even impossible to verify some of these claims. However, it is true that in the years following the incident, whenever Donald was questioned about the death of his employer, he would be very hesitant to speak on the matter. Things only seemed to get even more complicated and suspicious in the years following Loewenstein's death, especially when it comes to how Fred Baxter met his end. The remainder of his life seems to have been fairly turbulent. He struggled with a gambling addiction and became indebted to many different lenders. This is a fairly common outcome for lottery winners and others who suddenly find themselves with a vast amount of wealth. Shortly following Alfred's death, Bobby Loewenstein, his son, ended up employing Fred Baxter as his own personal valet, allowing him to live in his home. Things seemed to be going fine considering the circumstances until April 22nd, 1932, when Baxter had been visiting Bobby's apartment. According to Bobby, he left Baxter inside and stepped out for a short while. Upon returning, he found a note taped to the door reading, "Don't come in, go and stay with the Countess," referring to the woman who lived next door. He then says he entered the apartment, finding Fred sprawled out on the floor with Bobby's revolver laying nearby. He died shortly after, with his death being ruled as a horrific suicide. Many have speculated that Fred may have been unable to keep the secret of what he had done to the boy's father, and in a moment of clarity, revealed the truth, that he had played a part in his father's murder. He was shot with Bobby's gun after all, and the idea that Fred committed suicide while visiting his apartment seems a bit odd. On top of that, many of those who were close to Fred say he never would have taken his own life. In my own opinion, the official story saying that Alfred just accidentally walked out of the plane seems very unlikely. The problem with getting to the bottom of this case in 2023 is that it happened nearly 100 years ago, and all of the intense media speculation back then makes it very difficult to piece fact from fiction. All of the important information with respect to Loewenstein's death comes from the personal accounts of those who were there on the plane with him that day, which leaves us to either agree with them or disagree and speculate on our own. If Loewenstein really was murdered that day, for all intensive purposes, it seems to have been a success. Since it happened over international waters, no country ever stepped forward to investigate the death, and as a result, nobody was ever charged. Now that everyone involved in the case has long since passed away, we'll likely never truly know what happened to Alfred Loewenstein, one of the richest men in the world.